Russia against Ukraine and its devastating impact on human lives and thereby for making this highly important event possible. Let me thank you for your efforts in further cultivating the human development agenda, for your significant contribution to the understanding of the trends that mark our current European reality, thus helping all stakeholders to transform the lessons learned into our policies and, even more importantly, into our everyday practices. Perché siamo in Italia, vi auguro in italiano cordialmente un buon proseguimento dell'evento odierno. Grazie.
We thank the ambassador for her words. I think it's important to think that we are, this is the European presentation of the report. And so I would like to start asking Mauro Massoni to address us with the perspective from the Italian government.
Thank you, Emma. Assistant Secretary General Ulrika Moder, Member of the European Parliament Udo Bullmann, President of Generali Andrea Sironi, Executive Director of Human Safety Net Foundation Emma, autorità civili e militari, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. Italy is proud that the European launch of the UNDP Human Development Report takes place here, in this historical site of Generali, Procuratie Vecchie, that has recently reopened and that now hosts a foundation, the Human Safety Net Foundation, devoted to pursue human security and sustainable development. My country is a traditional advocate of multi-stakeholder partnership. It is also for this reason that we share excellent relation and long-standing collaboration with UNDP. Let me say that this relationship has been progressively complemented by partnership with the Italian private sector and NGO, such as the one with Generali and the Human Safety Net Foundation that we are witnessing in this important occasion. Increasing challenges faced by ODA's budget constraints due to multidimensional crisis and to a depreciation of currency of some of the main donors require strong and coordinated partnership, with the private sector stepping up with a common goal of achieving the 2030 agenda. Moreover, the effective delivery of international development cooperation is essential to achieve the 2030 agenda, as well as strengthening the coherence between humanitarian development and peace effort. Data from the Human Development Report are staggering. The last 2 consecutive years eroded the progress of the previous 5 years in terms of development. According to the Human Development Index, we are back to 2015, when the 2030 agenda was adopted. Particularly significant is that both in 2020 and 2021, the decline affected 90% of the countries in the world, and that the perception of human insecurity has also grown in those countries with an overall high HDI. Italy, unfortunately, is among these countries experiencing a reduction in its HDI. However, we can proudly say that Italian engagement in achievement of the SDGs with our partner countries is not decreased. Italy, in fact, is working successfully to uphold its development cooperation policy with a considerable growth in its budget share. In 2021, the total Italian ODA was 5.16 billion euro, with an ODA gross national income ratio of 0.29%, up from 0.22% in 2020. Despite our growing effort, we are concerned about this year's report, which clearly highlights multi-layer uncertainties due to the intertwined crisis. The effects of 3 years of COVID-19 pandemic, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, and its direct and indirect effects on food and energy insecurity and political instability have highlighted the fragility of the international order as we knew it. According to the latest UN data, in 2022, 274 million people will need humanitarian assistance and protection. This number, which is growing, still growing considering as we approach the end of the year, was already the highest figure in decades. We are facing a one-in-a-generation challenge. Peace and security, rule of law and democracy, human rights must be redressed and upheld as prerequisite for sustainable development and part of the broader approach to human security. Let me conclude my very short comment by expressing, on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Development Cooperation, the gratitude and the gladness for the partnership among UNDP, Generali and Human Safety Net, which made possible to organize for the first time in Italy this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to move to our next co-host. Ulrika, I would like to ask you, the report talks a lot about uncertainty, and I think this morning we saw a certainty, which is the high tide that made it hard for many people to join us here. So what does it mean today on UN Day to be here, to be discussing the report and the way forward?
Thank you, Emma, and let me start also by thanking all of you who made it through the water, or maybe you found the back door and a better entrance than I did, but certainly, Emma, it showed us what we are facing. And yet we would know, of course, that Venice really is also a place where people can meet internationally and discuss solutions to the problems. So I think it's a great opportunity to be here, and I also want to start by thanking, of course, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Development Cooperation, but also generally for the important partnership. And I was thinking, as we listened to the introductory remarks, also about the importance of insurance companies and also your Human Safety Net Foundation looking at the long-term solutions. And indeed, of course, with the data and the richness of this report that we have issued since 1990, this is also what we do as UNDP with our Human Development Report. Really one of the flagship reports of the UN that lay the basis and foundation for discussions across the world, within communities, but also between countries, how to find solutions to the problems that we are facing. And indeed, in this time that we're in, that we also define as a new epoch that we call the Anthropocene, where we also see how human actions have caused a major problem for us through climate change. We need to look at what is human development also within the aspects of the Anthropocene. You would know that the Sustainable Development Goals also compromise really how we are to look for sustainable economic development, but we can only do that if we look for sustainable also social development and environmental and climate as an aspect to this. And of course, I mean, not to state the obvious, but yes, we are moving from crisis to crisis, and we are in a situation where we see this uncertainty complex with crises compiling on top of each other. Already ahead of the pandemic, we could see the numbers being quite concerning because of the climate and biodiversity crisis. We also issued a report ahead of the pandemic looking closely into the increasing inequalities and what they make with regards to what was mentioned also in the film clip, with regards to political polarization. We have the technological upheavals, and in 2022 we really see all of these different aspects of crisis piling up, and of course also the ripple effects of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And I believe what we see is that this is happening in a speed and at a scale that we have not seen before. And it has been mentioned, I mean, since 1990s, we have not seen the numbers go in the wrong direction as we do right now. The pandemic, UNDP had the role to accompany countries alongside with colleagues in the World Bank to look at how the vaccine inequity also drove the increasing inequalities, the climate shocks, the rapid technological innovation and social mistrust is really whipping up this perfect innovation and social mistrust is really whipping up this perfect storm that is causing concerns with regard to human progress. So, as has been said, but just to say it again, this is the first time in 32 years since UNDP has been calculating the Human Development Index, which measures a nation's health, education, standard of living, where we see the decline 2 years in a row. Human development has fallen back to 2015-2016 levels, and we are moving in reverse in relation to the sustainable development goals that we have as an international community promised to deliver on until 2030. And as was said as well, this is really not only a concern for the countries in the global south. On the contrary, we see a lot of middle-income countries, and we also see upper-income countries moving in reverse. So it's really something that we have to look close into together, and where I'm also happy to hear that the Italian government does not see this as a contradiction. On the contrary, of course, many, if not all of these problems tells us that we have to invest and double down on investments in human development nationally, but it cannot be done at the cost of international cooperation. 9 out of 10 countries registered a decline across all different economies, and more than 40% declined in both years. So the crisis is, of course, still deepening, and this was mentioned as well. We have not seen the end of this yet. The ripple effects and the cost of living crisis that we see, the energy crisis, and all the insecurity that we have also because of the many increasingly protracted crises and conflicts are affecting us for the years to come as well. It is, of course, tempting, and this was mentioned as well for many politicians, to look at the short-term solutions. UNDP has been accompanying countries to see how we could support fossil fuel subsidy reform. And you would know that right now in most countries, including also my country, Sweden, governments are really looking into how to increase subsidies instead of redesigning reforms to see how they could meet the needs of many groups in societies that would need support. This is where UNDP comes in, where we can use the data and the analysis of the report, where we can use our partnerships and see how we can be then of support to design more clever long-term reforms that would still enjoy the support of the public, because this is, of course, also, given the election cycles, the concern of any politician in any country across the world. Here's where we have to be of support and really give that guidance. And also be that global, truly global network here at the UN Day, the 24th of October, also to advise, also based on many different countries' experiences, looking at different political economies and how they can come together. We know that a lot of things have to be done. Science tells us, policymakers know, and yet we are not doing what is needed. There is no simple answer to why this is the case, but of course there are many reasons. And I would like to point at something that was also mentioned in the film clip, and I believe, Pedro, you will speak more about that, and because this also makes me really concerned, I must say, and that is how people perceive the situation. How people perceive that they are powerless, that they don't have agency in a time where we know that we are better educated, more informed, or at least we have access to more information that than we have never had before. They feel unsafe, they feel threatened, even by, while traditional metrics of development are really showing progress. How can this be? So in the report, you will find a number that we did not see, and that is that 6 out of 7 people across the world feel increasing insecurity about their future. Just imagine what that will do to our societies. 6 out of 7 people. And global mistrust has never been so high. Only 30% of the world's population, if we look at the big numbers, believe in people around them, in their societies, only 30%. And then, of course, and this was also what we saw, and it makes me really concerned, we also see a high increase with regards to mental health problems. 10%, and of course, I would guess Pedro can speak about the also lack of data that we would find in many of the areas, but still an increase of 10%. So no wonder that we see polarization, increasing mistrust, and why it is difficult to find these more medium and long-term solutions. The report says we need to double down in human development. What we believe is that we need to work with governments, but also with many actors in society. And this is, of course, once again, where we're happy to work with Generali, who is also looking at long-term solutions in your thinking, how we can really prepare ahead of the next pandemic, how we can support countries to move through the socioeconomic crisis, still with the idea that they have to deal with climate change at the same time. What kind of policy reforms could really be put in place? So I saw yesterday, and someone has prepared these notes also for me, that Marco Polo, the great Venetian, as you know, once said, "Without the stones, there is no ark." And this is, of course, an idea that has echoed in the opening of this first Human Development Report. People are the real wealth of nations. We have to invest in people, to make people center and part of solutions, to believe and not underestimate people, but really believe that they want to be part of the solution. I think that this is perhaps the most important message. The agency of people to believe, not least in the young generation, that there are solutions to these times that we are facing that are going to be very troubled, as we know from the date of this report, and for the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Rika. And because this is the European presentation, I'm very grateful that we have Mr. Broman connected from Brussels. And I think what could be interesting would be that, in a way, Europe is a laboratory of the future, of some of the even difficult things that lie ahead of us. And you know, what is your view from your perspective on the report and how we can collectively act towards it in the face of the challenges we have today?
First of all, good morning, Venice, and greetings from Brussels, European Parliament. I'm more than happy that you invited me to join in this important discussion this morning. Distinguished guests, dear panelists, let me start with a personal remark. When I started reading through the report, I was on an aircraft coming back to Brussels from an exhausting foreign trip. I admit I was a bit tired, but reading myself through the first lines of the report, I really became wide awake and totally energetic, because I saw immediately that this is one of the best pieces, analytical pieces, I had in my hands for really months and years, because here you find it all. The accumulation of global crisis, the trace of man-made impact on the global era of Anthropocene, as you call it, merging in, this is more or less the headline of the report, the new uncertainty complex. You talk about the paradoxes that on the one hand, our capacity has never been bigger to influence, to shape our future to the better. And on the other hand, in a certain way, our hands seem to be tied. We stay far too often unable to act. The way in which you describe this holistic picture discusses more than one dimension. You speak about the policies of governing actors, but also about the importance to have a look at hegemonial interpretations in societies, as well as on old and new cleavages, where we fall apart into cultural silos and new polarizations, making us unable to unfold the capacity of humankind. So it's a real challenge, and I'm grateful for the optimistic final, bringing us back to the idea that it's about people, and people can change the conditions and the projections for the future by starting to do something useful and acting together. And my part, I understand, is to give you a short intro on where I see Europe, where I see the European Union. And my main message, which is perhaps important for our discussion this morning, is, yes, I think the European Union has started to deliver, but no, I don't think that we are already there where we should be. On the one hand, we have taken big steps forward. The European Green Deal is foreseen to invest at least €1 trillion in in sustainable investments, developments over the next decade. This is a big step forward, including the member states and giving direction to, as a compass, to what the European Commission should long for. We have found a new way to collaborate with the Global South, calling it Global Gateway, in order to mobilize some 300 billion for climate and energy, for transport, healthcare, education and research. And we have a new financial instrument, Global Europe, some 80 billion euro for international partnerships. And we as the European Parliament have not only the pleasure but also the obligation to scrutinize whether these programs are acted out, elaborated to the political purpose, and really creating new partnerships with actors in the Global South. Why did I say we are not already here? And that is my contribution to the debate of what has to be done further on. I think we as Europeans have to realize, indeed, the Commission has said we would like to become a global actor. We have to realize we are already a global actor, not always in the way we should like to be, but we need to have a proper analysis about our spillover effects. Do we really tackle inequalities, SDG 10, as a strategic element of progress? Do we do everything to spearhead and lead by example towards the 2030 agenda? So that is a very question on not only our development policies, it's a very question on technology, on trade, on agriculture, on industry. And therefore, I'm very happy that we are arguing and could convince already the Commission to come forward with a voluntary review of what we do on the SDGs in 2023. That voluntary review should also be part of the high-level dialogue on progress in July of next year. And the very question at the end of my contribution this morning, I found very interesting what the report tells us about the role of narratives. Narratives matter. They influence the next generation, they give hope, they inspire political actors, but not only political actors, also business people, civic society communities, to turn to the better and to join forces. Think about the part of narrative economics that you find in the report. And here my very question to all of us is, have we really already found common language? Have we really already found the positive narrative that is inspiring the young generation in our schools, in our workplaces, in our universities? Have we already found common language for policymakers and business people and trade unionists striving to the same goal of making the 2030 agenda real in the years to come? This is what I would like to concentrate on also in our work in the European Parliament. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your considerations and also your thought-provoking questions, and maybe we can pick some of them up later as we discuss in our panels. Now I would like to move over to the chairman of Generali, Professor Andrea Sironi, because the report talks about the 3 I's: investments, insurance and innovation. And the private sector, of course, has a role to play in this, and we are very happy that since a few months we've embarked on a new partnership with UNDP to work exactly on this. So I would like to ask our chairman here, given his role in Generali, but also his many years of studying the topic of risk, if he could give us his view on the report and what is Generali doing about insurance and inclusion.
Thank you, Emma. First of all, let me thank our colleagues and friends from the United Nations and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for this joint effort here today. It's really, we are at Generali particularly pleased and and honored to and proud to be hosting the presentation of this very important report. It's really a pleasure and an honor for us. Let me say that I believe this report is particularly relevant, and it's been highlighted by Ms. Moder already, for two issues, I think. One is it's presenting very clearly facts, and I think that these evidences are clearly the first step if you want to implement policies like... I'm sorry? I think we should mute, maybe it's Mr. Buden. Okay. And I think that is the ground if we want to build policies which are effective. And a second point I think it's particularly relevant is that it's deeply looking at perceptions. I mean, how people perceive the evolution of the context where they live, and that is also extremely important because, I mean, investing in those aspects is particularly relevant, and the fact, the evidence that Ms. Moder was presenting in terms of mental health, and if I recall correctly, was especially relevant for younger generations that we also see in developed countries. I think it's especially relevant. Now, as it's been mentioned, the report highlights that for the first time in many years, the Human Development Index has been declining, which is clearly a very, very relevant fact. We at Generali want to do our part with that respect. It's also a pleasure that the report is presenting here at the home of the Human Safety Net Foundation. The Human Safety Net Foundation, as you know, is targeting the weakest in the society, refugees, minors coming from difficult backgrounds. So we see very much ourselves as a positive force in this respect. How can we do that? Well, of course, we can do it through our activities. We are the largest European insurer and a large institutional investor. So clearly, there is one aspect that we discussed earlier that is giving us an advantage in some way. It's positioning us in an ideal place, which is the one of having a very long-term perspective. I mean, given the fact that we have to match our long-term liabilities, we have very long-term perspective, and these are clearly problems that cannot be solved with a short-term perspective. Unfortunately, that is often the time horizon of politics. For us, is very different. We believe that our contribution should be grounded on partnership with international institutions. That is why, as Emma Ursic mentioned, we basically inaugurated our journey with the UNDP here in Venice last April. We see this partnership as especially relevant for these purposes, and more simply, for what is the aim of this partnership. I believe we can say the acceleration in the let's say, objective of accelerating the SDGs. And so that we see this partnership for. We also will provide technical and financial resources to the UNDP Insurance Risk Finance Facility, which we see as a very effective and important tool to achieve a more sustainable and resilient economy and society. So for us, that is also important. And let me also finally add that we see our role not only in developed countries and economies like the one we are here today, but very much also to raise the awareness in climate change and in these very relevant issues in developing countries and emerging markets. So that would also be very important for us. So thank you again, and thank you to all for being here with us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're now ready to hear a little bit more and go inside the report with the director. But before we do that, I would like to thank our speakers. So if you would like to take your seat. Thank you very much. Before I invite Pedro to take the stage, I would like to share with you a video message that comes to us from New York, from Ambassador Maurizio Massari, who is the permanent representative of Italy to the United Nations, to address us on this topic today.
Dear friends, dear colleagues, first of all, let me wish you a happy UN Day. I join my colleagues from Italy's MFA in congratulating UNDP on today's European launch of the latest Human Development Report. We are proud that this event is being hosted for the first time in Italy, also thanks to Generali and the Human Safety Net Foundation. The UNDP report shows how the Human Development Index over the years of the COVID-19 pandemic decreased for the first time in 32 years. This is an alarm bell telling us that people all over the world are feeling more insecure, more vulnerable, and more exposed to the challenges of life. The report is a precious instrument to allow us to understand how rising inequalities, food insecurity, disinformation, and disrespect for the rule of law are impacting the livelihood and the well-being of entire population, especially the most fragile. But the report also shares a path of action to reverse course and achieve our common goals. It is true that we live in a more unstable, unpredictable, and multipolar world where pandemics, climate change, technology gaps, and violence are fueling global crises. However, it is also true that we have the capacity to respond. We were able to consistently slow down the spread of the pandemic thanks to the development of new vaccines. Of course, our reaction was not perfect, and more could have been done in supporting low and middle income countries. But we were able to shape a solution, and if we continue to invest and innovate, our actions can benefit everyone. The uncertainty complex resulting from the ongoing crisis and societal transformations should alarm us, but not stop us. During uncertain times, we are called to come together and form innovative partnership among international organizations, governments, and civil society to relaunch a sustainable, inclusive human development. We must in particular address the breakdown in trust and cooperation among and within nations. We have to restore faith in multilateralism and support the United Nations system in its unremitting action towards the achievement of the SDGs. We must also strengthen good governance at home in order to deliver global public goods to our citizens. Institutions can be reinforced through inclusive policies aimed at collecting the contribution of civic and private actors. I therefore wish to commend the partnership between UNDP and Generali as an example of the Italian private sector's will to align its action with the goal of the 2030 agenda. Insurance solutions are indeed crucial to support families, vulnerable communities, and business in coping with unexpected events and external shocks. Here in New York, Italy continues to do its part to raise the global ambition on a just and sustainable future to everyone. This year, Italy co-facilitated the ministerial declaration of the high-level political forum that reaffirms the member states' commitment to accelerating the decade of action. Italy has also increased its core contribution to UNDP to reinforce our consolidated partnership. In my capacity as Vice President of the UN Economic and Social Council, I will spare no efforts in putting forward Italy's vision of a rule of law, prosperity, and sustainability. On today's UN Day, let me conclude with a message of hope. Solutions are in our hands. Let's unleash the full potential of the UN system, the government's action, and multi-stakeholder partnerships. Together, we can move the goalposts. Best wishes on a successful launch event.
Thank you, Emma. Colleagues, thank you very much for joining us. And I join Ambassador Massari in welcoming you, particularly today, that's United Nations Day. I must say I was very touched and very impressed by all the interventions earlier this morning. It's very gratifying to see how people engage with the content of our report. I must say that I must pay special tribute to Udo Bullmann, because often people say that the report that we write puts them to sleep, and he said that it made him stood up. So that was very gratifying to hear. So we've heard a lot about the report already, so I'll try to be brief and in a sense try to add perhaps a little bit more texture to some of the key messages that you already heard conveyed by some of the colleagues that already intervened this morning. So we heard about many of the challenges that we confront today. We know the challenges, and we also understand what needs to be done to address them. So the real question is, what's standing in the way? Why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we acting? And what the report suggests is that it's in part because lives around the world are being unsettled, and times are uncertain in ways that have no precedent. And lives are being unsettled in many ways. So you see on this graph that there has been an increase in the extent to which people feel stressed about their lives. Stress is the inability of being unable to cope with the demands of day-to-day life. This is what stress is all about. You heard from Ulrike, 6 out of every 7 people around the world feel insecure about many aspects of their lives. Let me give you another number. Half of the population today around the world does not believe that their living standards are better than a generation ago. Think about that for a moment. Half of the population in the world today does not believe that their standards of living are better than a generation ago. At a time when we have, as Udo said, more resources, better achievements in health and education, despite many people still being deprived and despite the many inequalities that exist, as a whole, we have more resources, more technology, more opportunities than ever, and yet people do not feel that way. But it's not only about perceptions. You've heard already many times that 9 out of every 10 countries around the world over the last 2 years suffered a decline in Human Development Index. But what this slide shows is how unprecedented that is. Every year, obviously, there are countries that drop on the Human Development Index. There's a recession in the country, there is some sort of crisis. Usually, 10% at the period of the global financial crisis, it jumped up a little bit more to 20%. And remember how big of an event that was, the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. 20%. Now, over the last 2 years, 9 out of every 10 countries. And as has already been mentioned, unsettled lives, unsettled minds. Just look at this slide. 300 million people around the world suffer from anxiety disorders. 1 out of every 8 people around the world, despite all the underreported that surely exists when it comes to mental health around the world, 1 out of every 8 people suffer from some sort of mental disorder. This is 10 percentage points than we had about a decade ago. Why? So we argue that we are facing what we call a new uncertainty complex. We are not saying that the world today is more uncertain than in the past necessarily. It's very hard to establish that. Uncertainty has always been with us, but what we're arguing is that there are 3 layers of uncertainty that are new. One has to do, as Ulrike mentioned, this idea of the Anthropocene. So we confront many challenges: climate change, biodiversity loss, the COVID-19 pandemic, that sometimes are seen as isolated and separated. But we argue that they are all part of a broader process of planetary change that is becoming very dangerous to us, humans, and other forms of life on the planet. So this is the first layer that is new. And these changes, these planetary changes, exacerbate and sometimes are being driven by inequalities between those that contribute to these pressures, emissions, pollution, and those that suffer the consequences. So this is the first new layer. There's a second layer that relates to the efforts to transition towards more sustainable means of producing energy, for instance. And Ulrika gave an example when we know what needs to be done, and yet so many countries around the world are backtracking, for instance, when it comes to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. We're going in the wrong direction. So this effort to transition puts another layer of uncertainty that's acquiring new elements. And then the final and third one is political polarization that is intensifying and acquiring new norms and shapes. So one of the reasons, or one of the implications, is that as a result of this new uncertainty complex, as I mentioned at the beginning, people are feeling more insecure. And the report establishes two very important correlations between insecurity, or people feeling insecure, and people trusting less in one another. That's the first correlation, insecurity and less trust. Second correlation is people that feel less secure, people that feel more insecure, tend to be attracted to the extremes of the political spectrum, which is what you see on the slide. So it's not an ideological thing of being on the left on the right. It's people that feel insecure tend to be attracted to the extremes of the political spectrum. So as insecurity goes up, it's no surprise that, as Ulrika mentioned, we have the lowest level of trust on record. Less than 1 in 3 people around the world trust one another. And it's no surprise that we see political polarization increasing in many parts of the world. In most extreme instances, this political polarization, this fragmentation, this division leads to violent conflict. Even before the war in Ukraine, we estimate that 1.2 billion people around the world were being affected by violent conflict. 1.2 billion people around the world were being affected by conflict. Not living in conflict zones necessarily, but being affected by conflict. And this has only increased over the last few months, as we all know. Democratic norms, democratic practices like freedom of expression are also under stress. So we face a context in which this uncertainty complex is leading to a context of insecurity that is driving polarization, lack of trust, in the limit, violent conflict. So what to do? Because the report is not all doom and gloom. We argue that uncertainty can also be seen as a context of change, of doing things differently. Progress, development, the idea of development is inherently uncertain. We don't know where we're going. We want to do things differently and better. And we could see that in the context of COVID-19, some of these new things, new frames of reference did take place when it comes to technology breakthroughs, for instance. I don't know if you remember, but when the outbreak started, people were saying that a vaccine for COVID-19 could take maybe 15 years, one vaccine, 15 years to develop. Do you remember this? In the media, that's what people were saying. Now imagine if we had to wait 15 years until we had a COVID vaccine. What happened in reality? In less than a year, we had not one, but many vaccines development, so technological breakthroughs. We had massive expansions in social protection, in cash transfers, in measures to enable viable businesses not to be bankrupt. Unprecedented fiscal and monetary policies around the world, so new reference points for policies also. And our behavior changed. We started to wear masks, we undertook social distances, so social norms also changed. So this is an example of how a context of uncertainty can be harnessed for positive change. But to do so, we argue that people need to feel secure. I think Andrea was emphasizing this point about perceptions. We usually say, well, let's look at the objective measures of health and education. Well, what if people feel insecure? So we argue that it's an important objective to enable people to feel more secure. And to do so, we believe that it's important to start in two ways. One is to look at new policies and new institutions. And the second one is to look at how to change social norms. This is where the importance of social movements, for instance, of narratives that Udo Bullmann also emphasized, comes into play. On policies, we emphasize the 3 I's: investment in people, insurance to enable people to cope with the volatile world, and innovation, not only technological innovation, but also social innovation. So I don't want to say much more about this because this is going to be the topic of the panel to come. I just want to emphasize again the key idea of the Human Development Report, which is, of this Human Development Report, which is that to navigate these uncertain times that we all confront, we need to double down on human development. That means investing in health, education, in people, their capabilities, but also in this idea that Ulrika mentioned also so clearly of agency, of enabling people to feel more secure and more in control of their lives. Thank you. So Emma tells me that I'm now going to take a few questions. So I'm very nervous about the questions. But if there are any, if there aren't, that would be better for me. Please.
Can you tell us something about the role of the media in this negative perception? Because I totally agree. Personally, I have a good position, I have a good salary, but my expectations for the future are negative. And I can imagine someone who is not sharing the same position that I have. So, what is the role of media? I think the media are doing a bad job on that aspect.
It's a very good question. I think the media is, in a way, a mirror of society and also a shaper of society. But what we try to do in the report is to dig a little bit deeper and beyond what the media does, what social media does to many of the drivers and determinants of polarization, to try to understand why are people attracted to things like conspiracy theories or to extreme views. And again, what psychologists tell us is, again, goes back to this idea of uncertainty. When people, all of us, crave control, we don't like uncertainty, we crave control. So a narrative, wherever it comes from, because the media conveys many narratives, not one, right? So any narrative that gives you this sense of control is attractive, and more attractive to people that feel more insecure. And that's why we find this correlation between people feeling insecure and being attracted to the extremes of the political spectrum, because those are the ones that give you certainty. We know what to do, we need to take care of. But I just want to finalize on this thought. The argument we're making is that people disagreeing is not what's bad. It's good that people disagree. It's good to have diversity of views. That's the plurality, the richness of society. The challenge we confront when we have this extreme polarization is that people lose the ability to talk to one another, lose the ability to respect one another. They antagonize one another to an extent that this dialogue becomes very difficult and sometimes impossible, in the end resulting often in violent conflict. So this is the challenge that we confront. So I would say that media, social media play a role, but I think we need to question and understand the mechanisms that lie behind the behavior that we see being exacerbated at the moment. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. First of all, let me congratulate you on a great report. I second completely what has been said, and also want to add from the perspective of a practitioner that the energy and the passion that is palpable in the introduction and in the forward really gave me energy and hope, so much appreciated.
Doesn't put you to sleep.
No.
Very good.
We often doubt a bit what happens in multilateral system. I'm like, oh yes, believers. So it's good to see that. My name is Valeria, and I'm a social entrepreneur. And I work mainly to unlock the potential of tourism to foster and heal communities and foster their well-being here in Venice, but also globally. I'm also on the board of an organization that represents 1,500 social innovators, 1,500 organizations of innovators, steering what happens at the European level, but also collaboration with the UN and government. And I wanted to start with a remark. When I read the report, I was like, we completely agree. Like, as practitioners working with communities, looking to build the agency to developing solutions that contribute to the self-determination of communities, what has been suggested is really like perfect. I mean, like the policies that you encourage are great. My point is also that we agree with another thing that you're touching on in the report, in the fact that the multilateral system might well be outdated, right? You're saying it's being built for post-war, but not for post-millennial. So my question to you is here, on this UN Day, as we're having that conversation, what do you see the new role of the UN system to be, to encourage multi-stakeholder collaboration, to help build the agency and collaboration at the level of their communities around the world? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very, very good question. So let's listen to ourselves. Let's listen to ourselves. What are we telling ourselves? We are telling that we need to transform our world, isn't it? That's the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The subtitle is Transforming Our World. I mean, it's not transforming it on the margins. It's transforming it in a very fundamental way. Some people argue that the transformation needs to be as fundamental as the one that took us from agricultural societies to industrial societies. So we need societies that do much more use of the digital opportunities, that do not rely on fossil fuels for energy, that have much more circular way of dealing with materials. So it's a big transformation. When these big transformations happen, we know that many new institutions appear. Many of the institutions that we now take for granted, central banks, joint stock companies, labor unions, trade unions, they emerge in the context of the transformation from agriculture to industrial societies. So the argument of the report is that we may be confronting a mismatch between the demands of these new, which we cannot even conceive of what it is, and the institutions that we currently have. Now, these institutions are all institutions, and they include also multilateral institutions, including the United Nations. So I think that we all have a responsibility, including in the United Nations, to recognize how and what we need to do to change and to adapt to support this transformation. I should also mention, because I think I need to say this on the United Nations Day, that my personal conviction is that, if anything, the United Nations now is more important than ever, precisely because of this polarization. We need more and more spaces, however imperfect, where people can come together and at least have a dialogue, where people can be recognized and define themselves not by a single identity, but recognize that all of us have multiple identities, that we can find common ground and find those aspects that can bring us together. And I believe that United Nations, with all its imperfections, is still perhaps our best hope to do it. Okay, last one, and I'll be very quick because I want to get out of here if there's no hand. Oh, there's one there.
Yeah, I see. Also, many thanks for the report. I think it's great. Which role does the rising economic inequality of income and wealth, play in the recipes for where are we going from here? I mean, we are hearing that from Thomas Piketty and other economists for many years, long before the pandemic and the war, etc., that this is the main reason for the polarization, for the mistrust, for so many of the symptoms of the multiple crises we have. It's SDG 10, and very, very little has been done to actually combat rising economic inequality. So what are you, in your report, actually telling us?
Thank you. We actually addressed that question in the 2019 Human Development Report, and I will not bother you with another presentation of another report, but let me just give you a highlight of the findings of that report. What we found in that report is that inequalities in income and wealth do matter quite a lot, and Thomas Piketty is one of our strong partners and collaborators, including on that report. But we looked a little bit deeper, because one of the paradoxes that we find when we're doing that report was that in many parts of the world, for instance in South America, income inequality was actually coming down. We published and did the research for this report around 2019. The World Bank, for instance, was saying this idea that inequality is going up everywhere is not true. look at what happened in, I believe the number was 2/3 of developing countries. And yet when you asked people, again about perceptions, when you asked people, people felt that it's not about inequality, it was about fairness and justice. And so during that year in 2019, we had protests that culminated in social unrest in some cases, in Chile, in Colombia, Ecuador, Hong Kong, Lebanon. So there was just a wave of protests that spoke to, even if income and wealth inequality comes down, people felt, or a large segment of the population felt they were not being given a fair deal, a fair chance. So we tied it much more to this idea of social mobility, and culminated actually that question with the work that resulted in us trying to measure insecurity and human insecurity. So inequalities are clearly part of the story, perhaps not only income and wealth inequalities, but also this idea of how fair and just people perceive their societies to be, whether they feel that they are being given a fair chance compared to the chances that others in society have. So that's an important part. But there's also this other dimension here of insecurity that we try to address more in our recent report. Thank you. Now I can go. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Pedro, for giving us some depth and also answering our questions. I think now we move into the final part of our event, and what we will try to do here is actually showcase some of the work some actors are doing to forward exactly some of the indications that the report brings out. Before I ask the speakers to join me here on stage, I would like to share the last video, I believe, from Renato Brunetta, who's a former minister of the Draghi government, and I would also like to thank Elena Bonetti for being here, former minister for the family, who's done some important work, policy work on the topics that we are discussing here today. And Renato Brunetta is president of the Venice World Capital of Sustainability Foundation. Now, I think this is an interesting example of the city coming together. So we have the public represented, but a lot of companies, including Generali, coming together to work around the concept of sustainability. What does it mean for a fragile yet very resilient city like Venice, and what can the future be? So let's have this video, and then we move on.
Distinte autorità, sottosegretaria generale Moder, presidente Stironi e cari ospiti. In qualità di presidente della Fondazione Venezia, capitale mondiale della sostenibilità, è con profondo piacere e orgoglio che saluto la presentazione europea dell'edizione 21-22 del report sullo sviluppo umano di UNDP, il programma delle Nazioni Unite per lo sviluppo, che per la prima volta si tiene a Venezia, la mia città natale. A causa di impegni precedentemente assunti, forse sapete che in Italia si sta cambiando governo, quindi devo fare le consegne al mio successore, non posso essere fisicamente con voi presso le procuratie vecchie, la casa di Human Safety Net, un luogo speciale per un progetto speciale aperto a tutti che vuole agire da catalizzatore dell'agenda ESG e che sostiene con convinzione, assieme a istituzioni locali, nazionali, organizzazioni non governative e altre imprese, l'ambizione di Venezia di diventare la capitale mondiale della sostenibilità. In breve è una prova ulteriore del nuovo rinascimento di Venezia e della sua regione, rinascimento che stiamo vivendo tutti insieme. Come riporta UNDP, oggi siamo chiamati a confrontarci con un complesso di incertezza inedito. Il livello delle sfide da fronteggiare si è innalzato drasticamente e dobbiamo reinventare il nostro approccio allo sviluppo per essere sicuri che sia sostenibile e giusto. Pensiamo solo alla transizione digitale e alla transizione ambientale. Venezia è probabilmente la più iconica città del mondo, è una città mito, è una città mondo, costruita su un equilibrio delicato tra ambiente e attività umane, acqua e terra, passato e futuro. È fragile e forte al tempo stesso, come del resto siamo noi, esseri umani, fragili e forti. E Venezia è una città artificiale che ha vinto il mare e che ha vinto i fiumi. per vivere ha dovuto spostare i fiumi e bloccare il mare. Una combinazione unica che rende questa città un perfetto esempio di resilienza, di reattività, un'ispirazione che ci dimostra come la via verso il domani sia al tempo stesso molto nuova e molto antica. Venezia è la più antica città del futuro, questa è la nostra aspirazione. La risposta alle minacce esistenziali che si parano davanti a noi non è facile, tutt'altro. Certamente abbiamo bisogno di tecnologie che servano al meglio ed equamente lo sviluppo umano, capitale umano. Senza capitale umano non si va da nessuna parte. Abbiamo bisogno di investimenti saggi, di amministrazioni proattive, di imprenditori lungimiranti. Abbiamo bisogno di università, di idee, di giovani soprattutto. Abbiamo bisogno di persone. In poche parole abbiamo bisogno di liberare il potenziale di ciascuno di noi. La transizione che dobbiamo mettere in atto può forse apparirci come una fatica di proporzioni erculee. Tuttavia personalmente sono convinto che possiamo farcela, in fin dei conti. Siamo solo straordinari esseri umani. Grazie a tutti voi e buon lavoro.
Ringrazio il Presidente Brunetta per questo suo intervento, ringrazio anche l'assessore Venturini che è qui con noi oggi per rappresentare il Sindaco e il Comune di Venezia che ci è sempre molto vicino in tutta questa nostra nuova attività della Human Safety e con la cittadinanza su tutti i temi dell'inclusione sociale. So now, without further ado, I'd like to invite on stage Lucy, Aurora and Jan, and I will introduce them to you as they join us. Please, thank you. So they don't have an easy task because they come in the part on the solutions, right? So some tough questions but I'd like to start from you, Jan. You work with UNDP and you lead the UNDP Insurance and Risk Finance Facility. And we've heard so much about the 3 I's being an important element of, progress going forward. And I understand that these elements, and especially the insurance one, was not to the fore a few years ago. So things have changed. And what is your work? And can you give us a couple of examples of what is actually happening or what you'd like to see more of?
Yes, of course. And thank you very much, Emma. Thank you very much to Generali for hosting today and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for hosting as well, and to everyone here. I'm going to take a slight sidestep to your question, if I may. One of the things I think, where is Pedro sitting? Pedro. If I'm allowed to say, by the way, I thought this year's Human Development Report was absolutely stunning. I'm allowed to say that as a UNDP person, and totally objective. And I think the issue was how the report articulates issues of uncertainty. And from a practitioner now working in UNDP's work on insurance and risk financing, which essentially, at its core, is about stripping away uncertainty and allowing us to grow in many different kinds of ways, I think the report is absolutely stunning. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of, if I may, an anecdote. So I grew up, I was born in 1970. I grew up in Northern Ireland. People probably know the history of Northern Ireland. I grew up in a place just north of Belfast. And I also grew up partly in North Wales. And in this period of time, so my early formative years were a mix of, essentially, conflict sort of environments, post-industrial kind of collapse, no money, no jobs, little security, a lot of insecurity in terms of the violence and so on. And yet, actually, even now, basically 30, 40 years later, living a rather comfortable lifestyle in Geneva and so on, actually, it feels more insecure. So that gives me very much relevance to my work. So, what is different between now and then, and what is my role as a practitioner in that space? So that really fuels a lot of our work as well. So, UNDP's Insurance and Risk Finance Facility, we work in 33 countries. And essentially, we work to not only, if you like, on the insurance side of things, but also on the 3 I's. Because it's the recognition that actually the insurance industry is also related to those other 2 parts. We know, for example, the insurance industry has $33 trillion under management. That's the investment side. Not a lot of it, by the way, goes towards sustainable development or goes into developing countries. So that's a core part of the issue. I think that secondly, there's a massive amount of innovation which is coming out of the insurance community, including, for example, some of the work that you're doing in the human safety work, driving forward innovations on migration and other kinds of things. There's a huge amount of that which is happening. So how can we in the international system, the UN system, harness that? And then, of course, it's the actual insurance side of things. Sometimes, just to give you as a point of statistics, if you like, because sometimes even inside UNDP, people might ask me, well, why is insurance really important? You know, why is UNDP working in insurance? Let me just give you two statistics. I was recently in Johannesburg in South Africa with 47 of our country offices. For those who don't know, if I'm allowed to say, Ulrika, Pedro, you know, the lifeblood, the strength of UNDP is the country offices and our relationships with governments working year on year, decade by decade. So we had 47 country offices there. And during my presentation on insurance and risk financing, I asked the question, so hands up, everybody, and there was about 100 people, hands up, how many of you do not have an insurance policy of some kind? Could be covering any aspect of your life and living. Not a single hand went up. But if you look at the statistics for Africa, essentially 9 out of 10 of every single person in sub-Saharan Africa do not have an insurance policy. So I'm basically saying to my UNDP colleagues, we have to transform this room into, you know, the rest of the population in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a huge issue. Why is it important only to you? And it should not be important to all the other people that we actually represent and serve, if you like, in our role of UNDP. So that's my first statistic. And my second statistic before handing it back, although I might not have got to the specifics, but the more generals, but I think it's important, is the protection gap. So colleagues who work in the insurance risk finance community, I imagine you've heard of the protection gap. Essentially, when you think of disasters each and every year, you know, there's a sort of, you can make a calculation of what is covered by way of insurance and what is not. And it's usually about $220 billion a year of losses from disasters, from cyclones, from floods, etc. Now, if you look at the statistics, and generally 50% of that is covered by insurance. Well, that's okay. That means 50% of that is going to be, if you like, come out of insurance companies and go into reconstruction and recovery and so on. 50% would have to be reconstructed from new money. In developing countries, it's less than 10%. So instead of basically 5 out of every $10 being repaid from insurance, only 1 out of every 10. So that means 9 out of every $10 is having to come from new sources. From the same countries that we've just noted from Pedro, have seen a massive decline in all kinds of human development issues and growth and so forth. So this is why UNDP is working in this space.
Thank you, Jan. So this is the very big topic of the 3 I's, but as we saw in Pedro's presentation, equally important is the whole area of behaviors, norms, values, and inclusion. And here I'd like to welcome Professor Lucy Kluwer, who started as a social worker several years ago on the ground, and then went into academia and is now serving as Professor of Child and Family Social Work at Nuffield College in Oxford. And we can say also we've been collaborating together in the past couple of years, supporting some of the important work that Professor Kluwer and her team are doing around supporting parents in the most stressful times, normal conditions that they face every day, exacerbated, of course, by the COVID pandemic. So my question to you, Lucy, would be, how do you mirror some of the data and evidence that the report brought forward in your daily work? And the most important part is, what happened with COVID, with Parenting for Lifelong Health, and what can we learn from that?
Thank you, and it's wonderful to be here, and just so exciting to see this report and what it promises in the sense of what is achievable in terms of solutions. And I actually just wanted to start by looking at you and asking you as a group to think back to perhaps this day 2 years ago. We were right in the midst of perhaps the worst times of the COVID pandemic. And perhaps if you wouldn't mind to put your hands up, if you were a parent during that time, or were looking after someone who was unwell, or a relative, or someone who was older, would you be willing to put your hands up and say if you were a parent or a carer of someone during that time? Well, first of all, I'd like to say congratulations, because I think we all recognized, and now over 1,000 research studies have shown, that this was amongst the most stressful period of people's lives. And what we've seen is that intense pressure that people were under, that families were under, the pressure of uncertainty, the pressure of economic pressure, the pressure of mental health, the pressure of just trying to deal with kids who are stuck inside a home with you, that uncertainty and that stress led to a 30 to 50% increase in child abuse in families across the world. And that is and I think I've got to be, I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. At the time they were 1 and 4, and at times all of us were really pushed to the limits. And I think what is important about that is not that was a global challenge. That matters. But what matters is that there was a solution. And the evidence shows, the World Health Organization has just found in over 435 randomized trials, that evidence-based parenting programs, just like the ones that the Human Safety Net supports in communities around the world, are effective in improving parents' mental health and children's and preventing child abuse. And so we had a moment then, a moment when we could say, what could we do? And we contacted colleagues in the UN, in UNICEF, in WHO, in UNODC, UNHCR, and we contacted colleagues in governments, in the US government, in the CDC. And we contacted 240 non-governmental organizations. And the Human Safety Net came to us and said, what can we do? And we came together in an extraordinary speed. Within 10 days, this collaboration had turned a set of evidence-based in-person parenting programs into a set of simple resources which could prevent child abuse and support families during COVID. They were worksheets and television forms and public service announcements and media, social media releases. And the Human Safety Net came to us and said, what do you need? We said, we need translations. We need translations into over 200 languages. They said, that's no problem, we've got staff. And organized a hackathon of translating these evidence-based programs into hundreds of languages. There may be some of the hackathon colleagues here. If so, a huge thanks from us. But what we saw was really, I think, something remarkable. We saw a set of agencies and non-governmental organizations, from tiny little organizations in Cameroon to Save the Children and the International Rescue Committee, come together with researchers to provide the evidence and with across governments and the private sector. And together, within the space of a year, we managed to reach 210 million families with these resources. 33 governments use them as part of their national parenting programs and part of their national COVID responses. If we think that there are 1 billion children a year experiencing abuse, we were able to reach, in one collaboration, 1 in every 5 of those. And I think this gives us a real moment of understanding that social innovation is possible. And these resources were delivered in every way, from national news in Pakistan to being put in Cameroon and Laos. They put them on loudspeakers, they put them on data sticks, and people walked up and down 500,000 villages playing child abuse prevention, supportive parenting messages to families. It shows that if we trust people, if we make things open source, if we bring together a collaboration where everyone just rolls up their sleeves and says, what can we do? Just like the Human Safety Net did, then things can really happen. And I believe it. When I saw what the Human Development Report says is possible, I think we have real examples of that.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And I think this is also a good example of unleashing technology for good, right? And so the human element, but collaborating with technology. And maybe I think the other aspect is the topic of scale. So how do we grow these programs to a size that can reach such a considerable number? But maybe that's for a next question. I'd now like to hear from Aurora. Now, Aurora is Italian Youth for Climate leader and a delegate to the G7 Youth Sustainability. And is now working in Brussels and is an environmental engineer. So I'd like to hear from Aurora, because in the report, we also see a lot about participation, inclusion, intergenerational, a view that takes into account all voices, also in the decision-making process. And I think, Aurora, you've experienced some of this firsthand. I'd like to hear from you what this experience was like for you, how you started, and what your journey meant. Yes. Also for others maybe in the room. I know we have plenty of students here.
All right. Thank you, Emma, and thank you, UNDP and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Generali for organizing this event. So as mentioned by her, I'll be talking to you about social innovation and how we can increase and ensure that youth participation is part of our society. So this year I've been taking part of two different initiatives. The first one being the Youth 7. The Youth 7 is the official engagement group of the youth to the G7. With this group, basically, I was a delegate for sustainability, and I was working with other people coming from the G7 countries, and we were working on developing recommendations that then we presented to the G7 leaders. This process, it was not just about developing the recommendations ourselves. Indeed, we first had a consultation phase with the National Association because we wanted to really be representative of youth voices and not just representative of ourselves. So we had this consultation phase. Then we had the negotiation phase with other youth delegates from the G7 countries. And then we had the advocacy phase, in which when we presented the recommendation to the leaders. So this happened in May, and it was concluded in May. And it's an example of how youth can participate in decision making. Another example is the Youth for Climate initiative. If I may ask, how many of you knows about the Youth for Climate? If you can raise your hand. Great. So the Youth for Climate is an initiative that was created last year by the Italian Ministry of Ecological Transition. It was created just before COP26 in Glasgow, so the climate negotiations. And it was an initiative that brought together around 400 youth from all over the world to develop a policy proposal and really discuss solutions that then were presented again to political leaders. I think this is a great example of youth empowerment. This initiative took place again this year. This time it was the Ministry of Ecological Transition worked together with UNDP. And the event took place in New York. The first year, the minister, Cingolani, said, okay, we hope that we can make this initiative forever. So we, as youth, were really happy when we saw this initiative happening again. And next year, this initiative will happen in Rome. So we have a lot of hope in this process. But what I want to tell you today is the lessons that I've learned from these processes that are about youth involvement and youth participation in decision making. I think that there are three important aspects for having a really sound and robust youth involvement in decision making. The first one is the structure. I think countries really need a, let's say, consolidated, robust structure of youth participation. This process, what I mean is to have a really precise process, which is monitored over time, so that we can really see what the results of this youth participation are. The second element is about representation. The youth representative, the youth delegates, as I was, we don't want to be a representative of our voices. We want to be representative of the voices of the many youth. So I think an important aspect is really to try to include as many associations, as many people as possible. The third aspect that is very important is resources. And with this, I mean both financial resources and intellectual resources. Because youth and young people need the resources to be able to take part in these initiatives. And also resources are needed to create these initiatives and to implement the solutions. And also, as far as the intellectual resources, this is fundamental because youth cannot just we cannot tell a person, okay, tomorrow you go there and you start speaking about this topic. We actually need to train them. We need to create them the right environment and the right tools and skills to be able to participate actively in this process. So
thank you, Aurora. That's really interesting also what you were saying about not just representing yourself but also representing others. And I just have a quick question about how did you start? You're now 26 and you were telling me yesterday that not always it's easy for somebody your age to find information of you want to do something, but how do I start? Where do I find the resources? So how did you start, and do you have any advice for anybody in the room here?
So how did I start? I think what made me start is my passion. I think I'm very passionate, in my case I'm very passionate about environmental issues. And then I became, let's say, an activist also on climate, on environmental issues. And I started to see that if I wanted to... So first I started at local level, like maybe with NGO. I was working on raising awareness among people and students when I was studying. And then later on, I got closer to the policy level because I thought that really to have an impact is really important to start from the local level, but also at the end of the day, what counts is the decision making. And so that's how then I decided to get closer to the policy level.
Thank you, and thank you for all the work you're doing in Brussels. I'd like to just go back to Jan a second and ask you, you told us a little about the importance and the framing of the work you do, but if I were to ask you what your hope or ambition is in the next years through the work, what can you tell us?
Thank you. Well, I guess in a certain sense, very crudely, to do a lot more. So, when you look, for example, at our portfolio, if I mentioned, I don't know, did I mention that we're working in 33 countries right now, but what I'd say is that demand is far outstripping our capacity to actually work in this space. And it's coming across in many different areas. So, for example, what we've heard today from the speakers and from the report, it's coming across in areas of agriculture, in business and financial resilience. It's coming across in health. Quite a strong focus on the interrelationship between social welfare, social protection, and insurance, where when does one end, when does one stop? So there's also the policy side of things, the product development side of things. So from a UNDP perspective, and from my perspective, is essentially increasing the resources for us to be able to move forward. This is actually, for example, why I'm very happy about the partnership with Generali, because it's about how we can, together with Generali's technical and resources, able for us to do more. Because we're not an insurer. We will never be an insurer. We do not want to duplicate the expertise that exists out there in the insurance community. So that's really how we see things. And I think maybe just in terms of ambition, I'd say. So the largest program of work that we have at the moment is something called the Tripartite Agreement. Again, driven with partnership with the insurance industry, has 15 of the world's largest insurers, reinsurers on the table. $5 billion commitment of risk capital behind the initiatives. And the first 10 of that will cover 40 million people, various aspects of financial resilience. And then lots more work will then spin on from that. But it's very clear when I'm looking at UNDP and its role at the country office, at the country side of things, and our partnership within the insurance community, that we can and we must do a lot more. And that's, if you like, a bit of a call to action, which is how can we work with Generali, with other insurers, with governments, and transform, for example, the way ODA is used in order to actually drive growth, and going back to the reason why we're here, strip away uncertainty. The one statistic maybe I take away from all the statistics, actually I think there's the one that you said, Ulrika, which was from the report, which was 6 out of 7 people are feeling deeply uncertain about their lives. Now, I think insurance has a critical role to play there. It's not the only thing, by all means. But how can we, working together, government, insurance community, development community, actually work with our government partners in developing countries to help strip away some of that uncertainty and provide certainty and also to drive growth? Because I do feel that's what insurance at its best can do.
Thank you, Jan. So it's about collaborating, it's about public-private partnership, and I understand it's resources meaning both money but also expertise, right? So I think that's That's an interesting takeaway, and I guess the topic is scale, and this is something we hear a lot about even in our daily work, and I'd like to turn this over to Lucy and then close. You gave us this very interesting example of the COVID, and I guess that was born out of the spur of the emergency and the moment. So how do we take some learnings out of this to kind of increase our preparedness and work differently even ahead of the next crisis for scale?
You know, I actually think it's already happening, and I see it, you know, even in this room. We look at this room and we have colleagues from government, from UN agencies, from UNDP, from the private sector. We have youth advocates, and we have students, and we have academics. And we're all sitting here together with one purpose. None of us needed to come. And that says something to me right at the beginning. It says that we might be starting a new era where we're perhaps less focused on the kind of individual needs and requirements of our role, and able to think about wider collaborations. You know, I thought this when I walked through the co-working spaces, that it's trying to think beyond our traditional approaches. And I see that we have these extraordinary opportunities to both think big, but then make that happen. And we look at something like these amazing ideas about insurance, and the ideas that we could take you know, a private sector concept and use it for massive social good across countries, across hundreds of millions of people. But then you can think, well, can we combine that with new technologies? We're working with the Human Safety Net to test turning these evidence-based, in-depth, in-person parenting programs from 14 sessions of families meeting together into a hybrid digital approach, which could be delivered to millions at a cost that a national government in Africa can afford. But then you start to put the pieces together. Can we not bundle the two together so that when people receiving insurance can also receive the things that they need to help their family socially get through a time of massive risk? It's all possible. These are not things that are beyond our capacities. They are real, tangible solutions to some of the huge challenges that we see. And I absolutely believe, I can see it here. It's not an imaginary thing. You're all here. You're all committed. So of course we can do it.
Well, what better way to close this session? So thank you to all our speakers very much. So if you have any questions, and I'm sure you might be, we don't have the time now, but I'd love to invite you over lunch to reach out to them because they will be available after. So yes, there will be lunch, and there will be the opportunity to visit our exhibition space, which is all about unlocking people potential. So if you have the time, I invite you to do that as well. And now, so I'd like you to, if you could take your seat, please. Thank you very much again. And I'd like to finish our session here today by inviting our General Manager of Generali, Marco Cesano, on stage, because in the end, he is responsible in Generali for the 3 I's. So I think it's a fitting way to close our session today. Marco.
Thank you. Hi everyone, good morning, dear authorities, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to everyone who contributed to the debate. It was really interesting, was really insightful, and I want to give back a couple of observations. These are not the most important thing that we heard this morning, but it's something that to me was really interesting. The first is regarding us as a community, the second regarding us as Generali, because we are actually can play a role. So the first is really in this journey, and this journey that we all started, no one can really make it alone. So that's the first topic. It's really impressive how interacting, moving everyone in the same direction, everyone pushing for something can make a difference, but no one alone can really make a difference. So that's really important, and acknowledging that there are different interests, different specificities, that there are diversities, that doesn't say that we cannot work in a stakeholder environment, in a multiple stakeholder way. So that's the first thing, and I think it's really important for us to keep on doing this, because only collaborating, including other people, we can push forward. The second, it's really interesting what we heard about the protection gap. It's a little bit our work, in a way, so as Generali. We are trying to do our work in a responsible way, as a responsible investor, as a responsible insurer, to bridge the gap on protection. Even the number that we heard today are averages. Inside the averages, there is a lot of dispersion. So even in the developed world, there are families that cannot afford any protection. So this is really important for us as a company who has not only a financial mission, but also a social mission. So it's really important that we keep on remembering that we have this social mission. And presenting this report from here, it's really important for us. So thanks a lot to the Human Safety Net, because this reminds us that as a player, as a financial player, we have also a social role. So I would like just to conclude that we will do everything we can, everything that is in our capability to make sure we bridge all the gaps, that we bridge all the protection gap and all the social gaps that we have. And I would say that there is no leader. There is not necessarily a leader in this journey, because what really matters is the network effect, so that we can all together push on this. And we will do our best, and after what we learned today, we also know that we need to push for narratives and perception, and we will do this, trying to do and to pull together not only ourselves, but also as many people as we can in this journey. So thanks a lot, everyone, for being here.